Okay, we're going to start. Make up time. Near was bad, so I have to be good and kind of move it along. Okay. So we're going to do it Bob Barker style. I'm going to call people to come on down as I introduce them, right? So we're going to start off today's panel. I'm Glenn Cohen. I should introduce myself. I've already come on down, right? Today's panel is going to be about examining what a carefully designed, implemented labeling program could do for the global burden of disease. And first, we're going to hear from Nicole Hassoun, who's a philosopher who runs the Global Health Impact Project, which is a proposal for rating pharmaceutical companies on the basis of their global health impact. Then we're going to hear from Josh Salomon from HSPH, who is at the center of work at the pivotal Gates-funded Global Burden of Disease Project, who's briefly going to talk about the project and present its wonderful website, among other things. We're then going to hear from Aidan Hollis. Aidan, you're supposed to sit up here. Come on down, right? Aidan is an economist who seeks to use the global burden of disease findings to inform the work of the Health Impact Fund, an idea which he'll briefly explain. Then we're going to hear about some student activism from John Sturm from FAS and Eric Gastfried from HBS, who will describe student activism around Harvard, including the notion of effective altruism. And I apparently don't have a seat, so I'm going to sit right over there. But I'm told to remind people to push the red button when they want to speak because it's being recorded. And if you don't push the red button, we will lose your brilliance for posterity, which would be a huge shame. So with that said, let's move right along. Nicole, you have the floor.
All right, so I want to start just by thanking Nir and Jennifer for putting together such an exciting conference. I've published several papers, and my book talks a bit about the policy potential of global health impact labels. But I want to talk today about an index that I've been designing. And if I can figure out how to use a Prezi, I can do that. All right. This is the Global Health Impact Index, a rating system that evaluates pharmaceutical companies' attempts to extend access on essential medicines around the world. Companies' scores are based on their malaria, TB, HIV, and AIDS medicines' global health impact. The index opens the door to many ways of promoting global health. It provides essential information for companies, researchers, policymakers, socially conscious investors, consumers, and the general public. Sorry. Consider just one way of using the information the labeling system, our rating system provides. Using the rating system, it's possible to give the best companies in a given year a label that they can use on all of their products, everything from pet vitamins to mouthwash that they make. If only 1% of consumers prefer global health impact products over-the-counter and generic products, that would be $360 million worth of incentive for companies to extend access on essential medicines every year. That's about the price of a new drug per year on a reasonable estimate. I want to tell you today how we construct the index. So there's basically 3 steps here. The first step is to do an effectiveness analysis to determine promising drugs' impacts, okay? And that's the hardest part, so I'll talk about that. We can then rate the companies based on aggregating their drugs' impacts, and that will allow us then to rate the companies either by their relative or absolute standing. Again, the hardest part is to determine the drug's impacts, and to do this we look at 3 things. The need for the drugs, the percentage of people who can access them, and their efficacy. So consider a simple example. Toy example. Suppose 100 million people die from a disease in a given year. If 50% of people have access to the medicine for that disease, and there's one medicine, then we would assume that that medicine could save 50 million lives at best. And then if the medicine's only 80% effective, we'd estimate that it would save about 40 million lives. In reality, we look at the disability-adjusted life years lost to the diseases, which is a measure of both the death and disability due to the disease. We look at global treatment percentages, and we look at efficacy data from clinical trials. Things are a bit more complicated than that because you need disease models and you have to look at different patient groups and so forth, but that's the general idea. So once we have these drug scores, then what we do is we aggregate by company. And you can take a simple example again. Suppose one company makes 2 drugs, let's say 40 and 60 million life years each. Then you can aggregate those and you might get a score of 100 million for that company. Another company might make 3 drugs and save 10, 20, and 30 million life years each, and that company then would have a score of 60. And so the first company would be ranked higher than the second company. Here's a map of some of our data for the disability-adjusted life years lost around the world. Red indicates a low number of dailies lost, and green indicates a higher number. This comes from the Global Burden of Disease study. Here's a sample of treatment coverage information for the main drugs for PFOC malaria, which we're looking at. This is probably the weakest version of the data in our model. It comes from the WHO, however, so we're using that for now. And then we also use WHO information on efficacy for these drugs. This is for erythema lumefantrine. Actually, this is collected data. We've done a systematic review of data to get this efficacy information. The result, again, is a ranking of companies. Here you see the percentage of the disease burden that's alleviated by the companies together, that's alleviated by each company. So I'd like to thank all the people and organizations supporting the index, my team at Binghamton, Carnegie Mellon, Pittsburgh, and Johns Hopkins for their help in constructing it. And we're currently seeking to expand our network and engage in new collaborations. We hope that one day everyone can support this global health impact rating system and create incentives for companies to extend access on essential medicines globally by purchasing products with a global health impact label, investing in global health impact certified companies, and so forth. Together, we can make a difference for global health. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. So you've already heard Nicole mention the Global Burden of Disease study. What I wanted to do in my 5 to 7 minutes was to give you a brief introduction to that study for some of you who may be less familiar or not at all familiar with it. So what is the Global Burden of Disease study? Well, this is an effort that was initiated back about 20 years ago now, originally with support from the World Bank. Much of the work was done here at Harvard School of Public Health. But the goal of the effort is to try to quantify the comparative magnitude of health losses. So this is not a measure of economic well-being or any sort of broader notion of welfare, but health losses, and to attribute those to diseases, injuries, and risk factors in such a way that we can also look to disaggregate these impacts by age, sex, country, and at different moments in time. So the study was originally launched back around 1991, and results have been published in various iterations since then, including efforts to expand from a global or regional focus to national burden of disease studies. So this is all what was done sort of until recent years. The most recent round of this study, the Global Burden of Disease 2010, was a vast expansion of the scope and ambition of the study. So for the Global Burden of Disease 2010, for the first time, the unit of analysis was 187 countries. For the first time, there was estimation at 2 points in time to allow comparison. And there was also an expansion of the list of diseases, injuries, and risk factors that were examined. So a list of about 300 diseases and injuries as causes of lost health, about 1,160 disabling consequences of these that go under the rubric of sequelae, and also attribution of lost health, not just to disease and injury causes, but to some 70 different risk factors. This was a vast collaborative undertaking that was led from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington, steered by a group of 5 core academic institutions, including Harvard, but involving about 500 collaborators in 300 institutions around the world. The results from the GBD 2010 were published about a year ago now in a series of papers in The Lancet. and that was publication of the global and regional results. Since that time, there have been a handful of national burden of disease studies that have been published in the US, the UK, China, and elsewhere. And the study has moved into the next phase, which will include more regular updating of the study on an annual basis. We'll add components such as projections, longer list of causes, and in some places, an effort to disaggregate to a sub-national level. So in a very brief amount of time, I want to give you the sort of 50-cent tour of the results. Overall, given the scope of this with countries, multiple causes, 2 points in time, disaggregation by age and sex, there's about 650 million different results. So one of the important pieces of the GBD 2010 has been to try to develop some data visualization tools that are made publicly available and hosted on the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation website to try to really make this information accessible to policymakers or virtually anybody who has access to a computer and internet. So these are live data visualization tools that you can find on the web, and let me use these to give you a very quick spin through some of the results. There are several of these different tools available. Thank you. This is one that lets you get a broad sense of the burden of disease at different levels. So I'm showing you global levels. This is the burden of disease in 1990, and the metric here is simply counts of death. The colors show you the disaggregation into 21 broad causes. Each of the stacked bars is an age group. So you can see here in 1990, a lot of the overall burden of mortality comes from these young childhood age groups, but really a concentration of the burden in older ages and to two large clusters, so cardiovascular and circulatory diseases and cancers, primarily causing lost life at older ages. Fast forward to 2010, you can see that shifting pattern, even more so, the burden of disease concentrated at older ages. Now, of course, from public health perspectives, we care not just about the event of death, but in some way regard a death at age 80 as a smaller loss than a death at, say, age 10. And so there's another measure of premature mortality that actually captures this lost stream of life. And you can see when you do that, you get a picture that really does put more emphasis on childhood killers, which are claiming larger numbers of potential years. And you see things like HIV/AIDS come in, or road traffic accidents, because these kill people at young adult ages. Now, one of the really important contributions of the study is to introduce non-fatal outcomes into the dialogue on global health challenges. And so this is another metric, years lived with disability, that captures the prevalence of different conditions and weights those by how much health loss is caused by each. And you see here a very different picture of what are the major challenges. So we've got mental behavioral disorders here in light green, musculoskeletal disorders in light purple, diabetes and other endocrine disorders, and a constellation of other things. And so you very much see that the things that kill people are different than the things that ail them. So let me, in my minute that remains, show you another very powerful tool. And this starts with the same 21 causes, but is a sort of rectangular pie chart for the global picture. We can zoom in a little bit to make that more detailed, so you can see ischemic heart disease, stroke, but the size of each of these areas reflects the size of the burden. And you can look at that globally. You can look at that for a country like China. You can look at that over time to see how the burden has shifted. And what you see is the shift towards this blue area, which are the chronic diseases. We can also overlay a map beneath that. So for example, you can look for a given cause, like communicable diseases, as a big cause group of the number of DALYs by condition or by country. You can click on a country and see their burden appear on the top chart. Oh my goodness. Or we can look, let me just show you one last thing, which is the connection to risk factors. If you're interested in attributing things not just to diseases and injuries, there are also very powerful visualizations that let you think about risk factors, and you can combine these two. So that's a flavor of the very rich detail that's available. I encourage you all to have a look at that on the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation website. Really, again, the intent to make this information accessible to everybody around the world. And so let me just leave you with these notes that I won't go into given time. But how does this relate to developing rating systems for companies' footprints? I just want to clarify what this does provide and what it does not. It's not a blueprint for action. It doesn't give us the causal attribution of the burden of disease, but I think it does give us a nice platform for understanding the context of major health problems and metrics for trying to incorporate these into estimates of evaluation. So let me leave it there. Thank you very much.
Good morning, all. So I think it's useful just to start off for my talk with an assumption that if you did have a label that would increase sales and be somehow important to consumers, then in general, you think that labels, if they're going to affect corporate behavior in the right direction, you need to be aware of several key questions that you need to ask. You need to think about what kind of behavior we want to encourage, how to link that behavior to rewards. Usually the behavior itself may be difficult to measure, and so you may want to think about outcomes, for example, instead of behavior itself. You need to think about how accurate the measurement needs to be in order to be useful, and you also want to think about how much does bias in the reward system matter, because it's unlikely that you're going to have totally unbiased measurement or even unbiased transformation of measurement into rewards. So I want to talk very briefly about the Health Impact Fund, which I've been involved with over the last few years. The proposal is for a reward system which would be monetary, not labeled rewards, for companies that essentially agreed to make their product available at a low price or cost, or even to license the product to generic producers, something like that, and then would be compensated for this reduction in price by receiving financial rewards. The financial rewards in turn would be based on the outcomes that were achieved in terms of the health impact of the product. So what we're looking to do is to scale the rewards to measured, incremental, quality-adjusted life years, like the DALYs that Josh was talking about of a new medicine, compared to the most probable alternative medicine. So in effect, we're thinking about what's the incremental benefit of a particular product, rather than just what does it do compared to placebo. One important point to make here is that measurement doesn't need to be perfectly accurate, since companies always only respond to expected rewards rather than actual rewards that occur at a given time. Whatever behavior it is that you want to motivate is going to happen before the outcomes rise. So therefore, it's expected rewards that are the motivator. There are a lot of big challenges as soon as you think about, well, what does it actually look like for a company to license a product, or to, if it's going to, what are the incremental rewards that you, what are the, what's the benefit of a particular product in terms of the outcome? You need to measure the actual outcomes, which is a substantial thing. Second, and perhaps this is in a theoretical sense even harder, you need to be able to predict what the counterfactual outcome with the alternative treatment would have been. So had this product not been used, the person would have received some treatment. What would that have been? You need to untangle the effect of the medicine from other aspects of treatment, including other medicines. This is also complex. And then you need to compress the outcomes into a single index of health, such as QALYs or the DALYs that Josh was referring to. Those are all complex, difficult, and very challenging. The happy thing about this is that, in fact, pretty much all health insurance systems at the state level have been thinking about doing this already. So in Europe, in Canada, and I promise you also in the United States, more and more insurers are thinking about what's the value of a product in terms of its health impact, because they're thinking about, how do I deal with this new cancer therapy that's going to cost $100,000 per person? So that is happening everywhere in any case, and they're already thinking about pretty much all of these questions. What's the incremental benefit of the product? What's not happening so much is ongoing measurement of the product after it's already been included into a formulary and is being paid for. I just want to talk a little bit about the labeling issue, and assuming that you could overcome the challenges of measurement, you still need to make the measure relate to the reward in an unbiased way. So I think it's reasonable from an economic perspective that rewards should be proportional to the incremental benefits generated. And if you fail to do that in a systematic way, you're going to generate the wrong behavior. And in fact, that's actually the problem with our current system. I guess moving on to the second point there, right? If you think about the current system, the problem is that companies are rewarded not for increasing health generally. That's not necessarily the focus, but what they're rewarded for is especially increasing the health of people who can pay. So neglected diseases are neglected mainly because the people who would benefit from treatments are very poor and can't pay very much. So you'd want to think very hard about how do you make sure that bias in the measurement system or bias in the reward system didn't distort behavior away from desired outcomes. I also wanted to just observe that in general, I think inaccuracy is not necessarily fatal, since the firm does respond to the expected reward. And so I look forward to a discussion.
Hi, I'm Eric Gastfried. I'm a student at the business school and chair of effective philanthropy for the Social Enterprise Club there.
And I'm John Sturm. I'm a junior at Harvard College and co-president of the student group Harvard Effective Altruism.
Today we're talking about how our generation's attitudes are changing towards corporate social responsibility, how this has led to the growth of a new movement called effective altruism, and what this means for businesses that are trying to have an impact on global health. So our generation is the first to grow up with the internet, so we're used to having massive amounts of information and transparency available. So for example, factcheck.org checks on what politicians are saying and whether it's really accurate or not. And a lot of the times it's not accurate, so that leads us to skepticism. We're distrustful of big business, of advertising, of leaders, because we have so much information coming in and we can see a lot of the misleading information that's coming out. So in my view, the availability of information has allowed hypocrisy and mistruths to be more visible. This has led us to become more skeptical. And for some people, that skepticism could turn into cynicism or apathy, but for a growing number of people, it's actually turning into a demand for rigor. How do we know that something that's being advertised really works? If it's a cause in global health, how do we know what impact it's really having? So that leads us to effective altruism. Now, the idea behind altruism is to do good in the world. The idea behind effective altruism is to update this with these core principles, the first of which is maximization. How can I do the most good possible in the world with the limited resources that I have? So an example of this is if a dollar can buy 10 times as much in Uganda as it can here in Boston, an effective altruist would say, why not leverage that dollar to where it can do the most good? Rationality is another core principle. A lot of causes market themselves with pictures of cute kids or dogs and kittens, And we believe in trying to look past that and say, what's the real impact that this intervention is having? Skepticism, as I mentioned before, we try to look at the quality of the evidence behind the assertion. So if the evidence has had demonstrated to have impact through randomized controlled trials, we can have a good guess of the incremental impact over what would have happened otherwise. Transparency is another core value. The idea of making all the data and information available online, and also admitting failure if some of the things you try don't work. And last but not least, cosmopolitanism, the idea that all lives have equal value. So an example of how these ideals can be applied. It costs about $40,000 to train a guide dog for the blind in the United States. It costs about $20 to $100 to prevent one case of blindness in sub-Saharan Africa. So an effective altruist would say, obviously, we want people in the US who need guide dogs to have them, but recognizing that we can't help everybody who has blindness, if we can help 500 times as many people in Africa for the same price, then we should go where our leverage is the highest. So what this means for business is that we'd like to see stronger evidence of incremental impact, and we'd also like to see more transparency in terms of having the results available online and admitting failures even when some of the ideas don't work. John's going to talk about the growth of the movement and specifically what's happening at Harvard.
Effective altruism's main outlet for trying to do good in the world is charity. But the values that effective altruists have don't really line up with the values that traditional charity evaluators tend to have, which means that the recommendations those evaluators make aren't always relevant to effective altruists trying to make donations. And so a new charity evaluator has stepped up to fill this void, and that's GiveWell. So I'm going to go through the criteria that they use to evaluate charities, and hopefully you'll see how similar criteria could apply to evaluating businesses on their social impact. So their first criterion is that charities have a strong evidence of impact. Usually this comes in the form of randomized controlled trials on the interventions that they do. GiveWell looks for highly cost-effective activities, and that usually manifests itself in working abroad where there's lower exchange rates. GiveWell looks for room for more funding, not just past impact, but they think on the margin about how much you will get done in the future. And they look for transparency and accountability to donors. GiveWell's influence has been growing dramatically in the past 6 years. Here there's a chart of the amount of money moved by their recommendations, and you'll see that the trend is basically exponential. But effective altruism isn't only growing among donors, it's also growing among the next generation, that is among students. In the past 5 years, there have been about 20 to 30 student organizations interested in effective altruism, opening up at universities in the US and around the world. And that brings me to Harvard. So I run this student group called Harvard Effective Altruism at Harvard College. This fall, we've held a speaker series where each week we've brought in one speaker to talk about some aspect of the question, how can we do the most good in the world? Speakers have included philosopher Peter Singer, some of you are probably familiar with Thomas Pauge, GiveWell co-founder Eli Hassenfeld. And so these talks have been really well attended. We've had 300 students and community members to Peter Singer's talk, and most of them have had about 40 people in attendance. Finally, we're now fundraising for the 3 charities that we think are the most effective, and also raising awareness on campus. And Eric has been up to similar things at the business school. So we look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Yeah, and John will be available after the talk, and unfortunately I have to leave a little early because I have finals today, but I'll be available at the dinner tonight, so thank you.
I think I'm going to moderate from, and listen to my own advice. I think I'm going to moderate from here. Makes it a little bit easier. So we'll take questions in tranches of 2 or 3, I think. Yes. Can you say your name, sir, in the back and use the microphone? You stand up to one, next one's near.
Sorry, Josh, I shouldn't have criticized you. Tit for tat. Okay. I'm not sure whether all, I can say all, but most of you used an aggregate impact as the measure you want to use, and that is, how much did you reduce the global burden of disease in a particular area or whatever. Now, I spent most of my time working on allocation of resources in the health sector, and there I and others have rejected that simple aggregate impact and have argued for things like some special priority to those who are worse off, so that a social value of an intervention may be greater if it focuses on the worse off than an intervention for better off persons that has a greater total impact, aggregate impact. Do you think that there should be a work on a more sophisticated measure which takes into account people's attitudes with regard to equity? Are any of you working on doing that?
Hold your answer for 1 sec. We'll take another question.
So thank you for that fascinating panel. I have a comment for...
What's your name, sir?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Jonathan Marks at Penn State and a network fellow at the Ethics Center at Harvard. I have a question specifically for Nicole, which is I was a little concerned about perhaps an overly optimistic or Panglossian view of the labeling, and I just want to give you a reason why. If you put a little icon that says global impact on a pharmaceutical product or on indeed something on the supermarket shelves in the food aisles, there's a fair body of social science data to suggest that creates a health halo. And so people will assume the ingredient or the thing they're buying is healthier than it is. Do you have a way of addressing that concern?
Good question. So should I start, I suppose? Are these on? Okay, these are on. So yeah, let me just take them in order. For Dan's question, I have also worked a lot on principles we might consider when we're distributing limited aid budgets, and so I thought a lot about that. This project doesn't do anything like that. I do focus on diseases that are primarily affecting the poor, or at least have a large burden of disease in poor countries, and so in a way, it's already kind of focused in a priority manner. It's constrained by data availability, so why these diseases not the most neglected diseases. Hopefully we can expand the model eventually to include much more, especially as the global burden of disease includes more and more, study includes more and more, but these have the best data, I think, of the ones that I've looked at anyway, available. So treatment percentage is really the bottleneck for us, and if that data isn't available, we can't use this kind of model, at least without further data, perhaps of the kind that Aidan wants to collect. Anyway, important, certainly, I'm all for letting Millenial flowers bloom, and if we can do that as well, that'd be great. As far as the concern about a Pangloss on a label halo, right now it's a rating system you could use for socially responsible investment, many things, and so that was an example. I am interested in getting data on whether consumers would use it, and perhaps this is a good thing to also get data on. Michael Hiscox here at Harvard has done some really interesting experiments, so I'm thinking about doing something along those lines if I can find a pharma partner. Okay, and that might be something to keep in mind. How does this change the perception of the company? It depends a little bit on how you advertise it, okay? So we would obviously have to educate consumers about this label, what it means, and in that respect, you hope that it's perceived a little more like a fair trade or red product maybe than as something that could promote their own health. But yeah, it's certainly open to misperception, so thank you.
Yeah, just to react to Dan Brock's question, in terms of aggregating, I think there's two different types of aggregation that are worth distinguishing. One is aggregation within the measure across outcomes, which I think is useful. It gives you commensurability and lets you do comparative evaluation. And then there's the other question of aggregation, which is at what level of aggregation is your objective function stated? And there, I think there's nothing in the global burden of disease methodology that says that you only care about summary aggregations at a national level or subnational level. So I think the framework accommodates an interest in subgroups. So you may well be interested in the burden of disease among the global poor, among a certain wealth quintile, or among a certain disadvantaged subgroup in a population. And in that case, I think it would make sense, and it's quite within the realm of the analytic framework to do comparative evaluation of the burden of disease at different subgroups. And it's the direction that the study is heading. And so I think the first level of cut at that is this year there's a series of countries that are doing global burden of disease or national burden of disease studies, but disaggregated at geographic subregions. But I think, as your comment hints at, there's quite a lot of interest in disaggregating by socioeconomic strata, so looking at the burden of disease in different wealth quintiles, for example. And I think that the framework quite nicely accommodates that. There's huge data questions that are the primary hindrance. The last thing I'd say about it is, and you and I have had this discussion a lot, I think there's a disadvantage to having the concern for equity baked into the metrics themselves, because that takes away the ability of a policymaker to actually express their preference for concerns for the worst off or whatever is their social welfare function. And so I think as soon as you bake that into the metric, then that is one point of view about how much priority you give to the worst off, say. And so I think there is an advantage to keeping concerns for, say, equity outside of the metric itself, but using the metric in such a way that you can give expression to those concerns externally.
Just a small footnote. Just also a small footnote, we have country level data, so you can disaggregate, and we have tried looking at the burden in various different ways, partly due to data constraints, but looking at low income countries, looking at countries only in certain regions and so forth, so it's possible.
So I would just add on the health impact fund side that the design of the system is such that it's essentially organized so that the only kind of products that firms would ever want to register would be the products for people who are in fact likely not to be able to pay high prices. So by construction, it's essentially solving the existing problem that firms are not going to want to develop and sell products to the very poor.
I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and actually ask a couple questions myself, and then I'll throw one more on the Barbie. The couple I'm interested in is, first of all, can you give us any cringeworthy moments where you've seen your work be misused? Because that is one of the concerns in this area. So people misusing your data or misusing your work. The other question is kind of riffing off something Aidan said, and trying to get a little conflict on the panel maybe, is that I see kind of a division in two in the panel. So all of you need a certain amount of data to be generated in order to do your work. But one of the things I took from Aidan's perspective was that labeling is at best for the fifth best world, right? The world of second best, third best, fourth best, fifth. That it would be better to do this directly through funding, through rewards, through an impact thing, rather than through the labeling mechanism, because the labeling mechanism carries with it all of these distortionary possibilities, right? So I guess I want to ask whether you agree with that, and if so, it's because you think the first best world is not attainable that we're moving to labeling. And then let me take one more audience question.
David Vogel, one comment which I think relevant to the first panel and perhaps on, I appreciate the impulse to try to come up with a generic label that one can look at a company, et cetera. But I'm not sure that's a useful goal. I think I teach at a business school. Business schools are an enormous world of ratings. Okay, we have numerous ratings. They keep multiplying and multiplying, and then we have specific ratings, in terms of employment of women and foreign students, and then we have areas of ratings, how you are in finance and an undergraduate. I mean, so you have this enormous explosion of general ratings, which use various criteria, and then specific ratings within those, et cetera. And I think all of that is fine. I think, it creates lots of avenues. Everyone can say, oh, we'll find something which we're really good at. Okay? Gives people lots of opportunities to improve and compare themselves. So I think a bewildering multiplicity of ratings, I don't see any problem with that. I think the world of business education, which is the one I'm most familiar with, has on the whole benefited from this continued explosion of multiplicity and detailed ratings. Question, which are your three charities?
Our three charities are the three recommended by GiveWell. So right now that's Give Directly, Schistosomiasis Control Initiative, and Deworm the World Initiative.
Which are they? What?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
They're the three recommended by GiveWell right now.
One is,
Give Directly.
that's a charity called Give Directly.
Should I describe them? Do you want me to describe them?
Okay, well, let me just hear the Give Directly.
Yeah, so Give Directly distributes just lump sums of cash to extremely impoverished individuals in Kenya,
Okay.
who it turns out spend it responsibly. And then Schistosomiasis Control Initiative and Deworm the World Initiative are both trying to distribute treatment for parasitic worms in sub-Saharan Africa, some directly and some by influencing governments.
So, now, here we live in a world of zillions of charities, right? So basically, so I'm just trying to think about what, so this role is oriented towards a category of people, they could be students or whatever, who aren't interested in other issues in general. They're particular, they're sort of very, these people are very open, it's like a tabula rasa, and they have no particular religious, cultural, personal, geographic preferences. They just want to make the world a better place and be more effective. How many of these people exist?
A growing number. So our student group at Harvard right now has we're calling it a fellowship of 20 members who meet every week and who are doing the active fundraising. And then, like I said, our talks have been attended by several hundred people over the course of the semester. And I think interest is growing. We'll be having a new fellowship with 20 more students next semester.
Is Harvard worried that this will compete with contributions to Harvard?
Maybe.
Excuse
Not
me?
yet.
Right, so I mean, you're actually, when Harvard comes to its alumni and asks them for money, which I understand it has done in the past and is likely to do so in the future, basically, your people will be saying, no, I'm not going to give any money to Harvard, I'm going to give money to these three?
I think we'll be saying
What?
we want to see, so it may be that Harvard is, maybe it's paying for scholarships and educating bright people to go do great things in the world. I think we'll be looking for evidence that it's actually happening.
And I like to, just as a consumer of business school, there's definitely a lot of ratings on business school, but it's generally like pre-post in terms of like salary and outcomes. And
No, there's a lot more than that, though.
Well,
there's a lot more than that. There are many more dimensions.
there's a lot, but in terms of what the outcomes for me of going to Harvard Business School compared to going to another school, I would like to see Harvard like randomly accept some students and see what the incremental impact is over those same students going to other schools, because obviously there is intense selection bias designed into the system. So personally, I'd love to see even more measurement of the value of business school.
Great, let's get the rest of the panel in on the rest of the questions.
Should I start again, maybe? So just to address your question, I think it's fantastic. If Aidan and Poggi are successful, that would be amazing. Of course, we have to convince developed countries to become involved, and that takes a lot of money and a lot of contribution on their part. And this is, I think you estimated it at $90 billion or something, or Poggi did originally. Now hopefully it's much less, $6 billion. Okay, $6 billion. My rating system's free, effectively. I mean, I've gotten seed money here and there, and it can be sustained by licensing a label to pharmaceutical companies if we have a labeling initiative. So that's my plan on how do I make it self-sustaining, unless I can get socially responsible investors or somebody else interested, which would perhaps make it a little bit more independent, and you have to protect against industry capture, of course, by institutional protections of the right kind. It's not going to have the same kind of impact as a huge contribution by developed countries to global health, I don't think. But hopefully, a label, if you can test it, you can measure the marginal impact of the willingness of consumers to pay more for these products on companies, and that incentive then to create products or extend access on existing products more broadly to raise their ranking in the rating system and impact global health. I'll stop.
Just a word, because you had asked a question about misuse of information. I'm not sure anybody has addressed that. I think with the burden of disease, the two misinterpretations or misuse have come from, in the past, trying to compare things that are not comparable, and that was the major impetus for, in the latest revision, going back and re-estimating things for 1990 that does give you a comparable time series. And then the other is assuming that by quantifying the burden of disease, this is a prescription for policy, and I think that's a misinterpretation of the intent. If you look at the diseases, injuries, and risk factors that cause the biggest losses of health around the world, it doesn't necessarily suggest that you should invest in the leading cause of burden first, and then the second, and go down the list in that way. Of course, there, in the first instances, questions about what are the interventions and policies that are available to address the burden of disease, and then there are other considerations that all policymakers have other than maximizing overall health in the population, concerns for equity that we heard about, political realities. And so I think it's a straw man, but many people have put it up to suggest, the burden of disease should not be used to make policy, because I think that's not the stated intent, and so I think that's an important misconception to avoid.
Great. There's a question in the back, sir.
Yeah, yes, good morning. My name is Ron Morocco. I'm with the Partnership for Supply Chain Management. We serve USAID, the Global Fund, on the acquisition of medical technologies, pharmaceuticals, essential medicines for the world. And frankly, I'm sitting here and I'm sort of struggling with the content in some ways, because I think there's so many confounding, interrelated issues here that I'm having a hard time coming to terms with the rating. I mean, I'm really enjoying the conversation, but on one side I'm saying, so we have this rating system. What is the objective in the end? Are we trying to get more innovative products developed? Are we trying to raise funding for the developing world? Are we trying to improve access? Because for every one of those challenges, there's a very different, I would think, methodology to address it. And to me, this feels sort of like swimming in a quagmire of interrelated topics that make it difficult to get to the end game. So I'm hoping that someone could sort of define the end game, because clearly these are all interrelated subjects. I mean, we talk about access. If you're trying to rate companies, that might have the opposite effect if you start to put labels on them or guidelines, because when you deal with these companies, and I do, who are trying to bring products to the market, there's a real disparity between those pioneering, innovative companies and those multinationals who really don't have a strong reason to contribute to development of products that serve resource-limited areas of the world. So help me understand really where we're going and what can be done here.
Hold the question for 1 sec. Hold the answer. You, sir.
Yeah, so that was a question.
Just say your name first.
Oh, I'm
sorry.
sorry. Archon Fong, Harvard Kennedy School. That's a question that is interesting because it examines the company incentives. I wanted to ask something about the demand side. So for this panel and the prior one and this larger project, presumes that there will be sufficient demand out there from somebody for this information to put some pressure on companies to behave more responsibly with regard to public health. And so what I want to ask is whether people think that we've reached that critical mass of some sufficient demand, or whether it's in the future at some point. So you could think, okay, well, some arbitrary point, 1980, right? Most people still accept the Milton Friedman thing that the social responsibility of companies is to make money, and that's it, full stop. And then if what you hope and what I hope is true, by 2020, let's say everybody, all consumers and investors will take this kind of global health performance of companies to heart and what they buy and who they invest in. Have we reached that inflection point yet, right? And it's important because if we haven't reached that inflection point, then that calls for a whole series of preference transforming strategies and actions. If we have reached that point, then it just calls for implementation. Just roll out labels and stuff and the demand is there and people will do the thing, right? And it's particularly important for the effective philanthropy project, right? because it's a longer-term project to measure and to transform people's preferences, right? If people already have socially responsible preferences, then you can do your RCT and get your result. If they don't, then you'll do your RCT and you'll get the wrong answer if you think that in 10 years, through some longer process, some preference transformation might occur. So have we reached the inflection point?
See, I would start off with just the observation that the whole labeling thing is because you assume that companies, in fact, are just focused on making money and that they don't naturally have an interest in global health. And the idea is that consumers do care, or at least some consumers. So if you can shift their interest, that it will drive the corporate machines to be responsive. So that leaves us back in the unpleasant world of Milton Friedman. But there you have it. I think that actually that we've heard about a number of different rating systems. One, the EUA-EM one, would, I guess, focus on essentially trying to shift the interests of possibly students and faculty, and as to which school they want to be associated with. And that in turn would shift the interests of presumably the equally Miltonian administrative bureaucrats who run universities, who maybe don't really have an interest in social welfare, but actually, do care about whether they can get their students and faculty to be happy. In the same way, I guess Nicole's system is really to, drive consumer behavior. You could think about drive consumer behavior and therefore change pharmaceutical behavior. And you could think about the global burden of disease study as providing the information. It's kind of a label system on health outcomes. Well, stretching it, I guess, but which possibly gives at least the information to be able to change things. These are all focused on different kinds of, essentially different consumers who are going to change the behavior of presumably different actors.
Okay, so I guess it depends what you mean by consumer, right? So there's a lot of different potential people who might be interested in any of the information that we provide, and I think researchers are definitely one of the audiences for what I'm doing. So I've got a grant with a political scientist to look at, since we have country level data, look at some causes of contributions to, I guess, development in Africa. But I guess what I wanted to say was in response to the first question about the objective. I think it's a really good question. The objective that I have is to provide this information that has the potential to be used in many ways to incentivize a greater impact on the global burden of disease. And because I measure pharmaceutical companies' impacts on the global burden of disease, with two other pieces of information, this can happen in two ways. One, they can increase treatment percentages, or two, they can increase that drug efficacy, either by creating new drugs that are more efficacious, right, or finding old drugs. And so those are the objective. The objective I have, if you use this to incentivize change, either with a labeling system or through social investment, or even in conjunction with the university licensing policies or some other way, is to improve impact on the global burden of disease. And that's not entirely controlled by companies, so it could happen for a variety of other reasons. In a way, I don't expect companies to like it a whole lot.
I just want to make one comment on the access component of that. And regional trade organizations throughout the African continent, for example, could be one of the most significant ways to improve access if we engage them to take down the barriers for registrations of products that you're talking about in these markets. Putting a labeling system on would have other benefits, perhaps, but there are maybe bigger hurdles that would stand in the way that will always be there unless we address them. And do you have any thoughts on that, regional trade? And
this is the kind of thing you could use, some components of this you could use to measure the impact of regional trade agreements, I suppose. I haven't thought about it. I'd have to think about it because obviously wouldn't rank it by company in that way, but it might provide information for looking at the impacts on access to treatment or whatever. I wanted to also briefly address the demand side question, which, as you say, this presumes someone wants information. Well, I think it's really important information what, for instance, the Global Burden of Disease study provides, and I use it. I know a lot of researchers use it. I'm hoping that what I provide, this model, will also be of interest to researchers, maybe policymakers, and then possibly also through you consumers, if you can make it accessible, and that's why you might want the label, right? That it's like, okay, I don't have to do all my research. I don't have to go look at your index very much. I can if I want, but now I know this is like Buy Red. It's a company that's doing something good. Do consumers, are they interested? Well, as the previous speakers suggested, there's a huge growth in this ethical consumerism area. Michael Hiscox, looking at fair trade label, found about 9% of consumers were willing to purchase fair trade certified products. So using a randomized control trial. Will that work in this area? I don't know. We really have to do some studies to find out, but yeah, thanks.
Yeah, just briefly to address, is this working? Yeah, briefly to address from the philanthropy side. Yeah, I don't think anyone is thinking right now in effective altruism about these company rankings. So it's hard to speak to that. That said, the movement is very young, the people are very young, and they're very quick to take to new ideas. It seems like the sort of thing that could be fertile. Yeah.
Great. Yes, please.
Thanks very much. Good morning. My name is Suri Moon. I'm with the Harvard School of Public Health and the Harvard Global Health Institute. I lead an initiative there called the Forum on Global Governance for Health. I had two sets of questions. The first are probably primarily for Nicole, and the second for John and Eric. So for Nicole, I think one of the issues that's relevant not only for the pharmaceutical industry but for businesses, large businesses worldwide, is that they're engaged in many different markets, many different activities with many different products. And one of the challenges is, I think, by focusing on just one or two products, there's a risk of overlooking other activities of the firm that may or may not be conducive to the same goals that you've laid out. So I noticed in particular, to illustrate more concretely, that one of the firms that I think did very well in your ranking was Novartis. And Novartis has... Sorry?
They're at the very bottom, but it doesn't matter for your point of view.
So they're doing well in terms of supplying low-cost corundum to a number of countries, which I think many people would agree with, but have also been in the news over the last few years for a couple other issues for which they've been highly criticized. One is challenging the Indian patent law, and making it more difficult for generic companies to manufacture in India, and two is for increasing the price of Gleevec over time so that it's grown from, I think, $25,000 to $50,000 for the treatment of a certain type of leukemia. And at the same time, at the risk of increasing the cynicism of the millennial generation, Novartis has been noted for increasing its donations to human rights organizations, perhaps to offset some of the public criticism they've received. So the question I'd like to raise is, how do you take into account all of these different, sometimes competing factors? Does one cancel out the other? Should one be weighed more than the other? Can you absolve yourself of sins in one area by doing good in another? And I think these are difficult questions that come up with any kind of large, complex entity. The second question is for John and Eric. I think I very much like what you guys are trying to do by linking impact to donations and philanthropy. One of the risks of doing that, I think, is that you may select for projects that have relatively short timeframes, that are perhaps low-hanging fruit in a way where impact is easy to measure. So getting back to Josh's point that sometimes you measure what's easy to measure, not necessarily what one wants, what one may want to measure. So if I think about other types of important projects like women's empowerment or democratization or strengthening civil society, I mean, all important objectives that have an impact on global health, they probably wouldn't do so well in a ranking like yours because the timelines are long and the causal chains are difficult. So how do you take those types of concerns into account?
So there's one question back there, sir.
Hi, my name is Wahid Hussain. I'm with the Wharton Business School. This is a question for John and Mark. I love millennials, but I was going to throw out another interpretation of what's going on. Just, it's the focus on being very rational and being very effective in one's altruism has this effect that it directs all of this energy towards Africa, right, and away from the United States. And so, you'll find people, I find some of my students will be very willing to kind of go on an ethical tourist destination project in Africa. They'll do their summer project building a well that, I don't know if it ever works or does any good, but they build the well, they come back, and then they will, they'll go work for a lobbying firm or something when they graduate. And so, here's another thought about what exactly this kind of effective altruism is. It's that it reflects not just, I'm sure it's partly, motivated by the desire to do well, but it might also be motivated by a kind of avoidance of conflict, and that millennials don't like getting into difficult conflicts, and actually trying to maintain the kind of equality-preserving institutions we have in the United States that were hard fought and took many decades to build. That takes conflict to keep those things in place here. And we could do a lot of good by doing that here, but that takes conflict. You've got to actually fight that out. And it's a lot easier maybe to just go and dig a well in Africa.
Conflict avoiding slacktivism. Okay, one more question over here, and then we'll get the answer.
So I wanted to piggyback on Suri's question and ask, Nicole, how do you juxtapose global health issues with other issues, so ethics issues, environmental issues, when you think about this and when you present this to companies? Because I could imagine a company saying we have very little space on our product, our Advil, and it's going to cost money to amend the packaging. So why should we put a global health label and not an ethics or environmental health label? And I don't mean this because it's going to get us more consumers' questions. I mean this in a sort of deeper, normative way. Why global health?
Guess since a few of the questions were up, I'll go again. First, thank you all for the good questions. There are so many things you can look at, and there is a great index called the Access to Medicines Index, which looks at, it's much broader than what I'm doing. It's much less rigorous in a way also. So they, there's different degrees of rigor and there are different measures, but they look at the pricing, the research and development pipelines and so forth. But there's not any attempt to look at the impact of having a lot of drugs in your pipeline or having good policies, IP policies on the global burden of disease, and partly because it may be impossible, right, to trace those causal lines very well. I'm going to say it's impossible, but it's very, very difficult. I started with looking at just 3 diseases and drugs for those diseases. Maybe there's, 20, 30 drugs in the index. It can be expanded to look at many more diseases, assuming we can find all the data for that. But there's also other things you can include in this index. So you could, if you can figure out, there's this guy, Aaron Ben David at Stanford, who's looking at, he looked at PEPFAR, but various health programs and their impact on mortality and global burden of disease. The GiveWell idea, they have a Bayesian model. But you could, I think, look at many different things and try to figure out what is the actual impact in terms of the death and disability alleviated. And if you did that, that would easily be folded into this model and might have a lot of advantages. It's only part of the picture. So that's the ultimate answer. I don't think anybody can give you a complete picture, and you need lots of different sources and kinds of information. And this provides one that I think it's narrow but deep. Okay. I think as far as the sorry, I've lost track of the thing. Obviously, companies might be interested in this in part because not only the impact on their bottom line, but the impact on their reputations. But there's many other things they're concerned about. And to tell them what they ought to be concerned about, I don't take it to be my job. But I think that maybe in my larger role as an ethicist, but not as my job as a person putting forward this index. So, that's a discussion that they would have, presumably, about their priorities.
All right, I'd like to start with the point about the idea of sort of becoming excited about helping people in developing nations and just going there sort of as tourism. This is definitely a thing that exists. It's sort of a thing tied into cosmopolitan values, I think, but it is very much not an effective altruism thing. The effective altruism answer is sort of like, you go there and I don't know how much good you're doing for a week. It's not very much. It's especially not very much compared to the cost of your plane ticket, maybe even compared to the effect of the gas on the environment. That sort of thing is, from the point of view of most people in the movement, sort of frowned upon. And then, so you were tying this into avoiding conflict and asking, is dealing with these issues in third world countries sort of just a way of avoiding harder questions like how do you build democracy in a country like the US? I think this ties into the other point that you brought up of sort of focusing on short-term issues that there is evidence for. So first, I should acknowledge, it's definitely true that there is a strong bias in effective altruism right now to things that can be measured. And GiveWell is actually trying to change. They're starting this thing called GiveWell Labs, where they're looking less at short-term issues and more at more complicated things like how does politics influence, how does lobbying influence policy? Should they be investing in lobbying groups rather than paying for charities? So they're getting to these more fringe issues. But nonetheless, there still could be a bias, and that could be a bad thing. One possible reason why it might actually be good to focus on these short-term issues is, so you brought up things like various rights movements, all sorts of really important campaigns that have happened over history. No doubt, so when we look back on these things, it's very easy to say that they're very important. It's not obvious that it was, so like, there are many different movements that go on at different points in history. It's not obvious that you could predict which ones were successful and direct your efforts to the right ones. It might be that long-term issues are sort of just not predictable at all. And while some of them do end up being very important, we can't tell which it is.
Okay, one last question, one quick answer.
Do I grab this or just speak to it? Is it on? Great. I wanted to take issue with something that was said about volunteering or tourism. I actually think that starting with the Peace Corps way back in the early 60s, but also today with the many volunteering organizations which help sanitation projects, public health sanitation projects in countries like Ghana, that may be more important than ever before. And in fact, it's important for those people who might be doing that volunteering, even for a week or a month or 2 months, and they go back and then they become a pharmaceutical lobbyist or they become an executive at a pharmaceutical company, but at least they're aware of the burden of disease. They're aware of the problems which they would not be aware of otherwise. I think the human element is crucial. It's far more important than impersonal giving, impersonal charities. So I really do take issue with that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an important point.
Yeah, my name is Joshua Cohen at Tufts University.
Yeah, so I think right, no doubt. So the effective altruism stance is whatever it is that does the most good in the world, that's what you should do. And so for a lot of people, that does mean going there, and it does mean seeing things and being inspired. So I shouldn't be quick to say that's a bad idea. Effective altruism right now tends to be full of people who are exceptionally, you get a lot of people from math and philosophy, people who feel things more from an abstract structural level and less from having been there. But I think as the movement expands, you're totally right that seeing things in person is going to be increasingly important.